Good evening, everybody, and welcome on behalf of learners to tonight's webinar. My name is Richard Newton-Chance, and I'm Chair of Learners Council. Learners is dedicated to connecting educators and world-leading scientists who specialise in the study of the brain, the mind, and behaviour in order to use the evidence and insights from high-quality research in these multidisciplinary fields. I'm delighted to welcome to tonight's webinar Professor Emily Farran. Emily Farran is Professor of Cognitive Development at the University of Surrey, UK, where she directs the Cognition, Genes and Developmental Variability Lab. Emily completed her PhD at the University of Bristol in 2001. She then took on a lectureship position at the University of Reading, followed by a move to UCL Institute of Education in 2008, before joining the University of Surrey in 2018. She was recently awarded the 2024 Impact and Engagement Award from the Developmental Psychology section of the British Psychological Society. The broad aim of her research is to characterise typical and atypical development of cognitive functions within the context of the developing brain. This includes a focus on the relationship between spatial thinking and science and mathematics achievement. Her work has been featured several times recently in Nursery World. Today's webinar is entitled Spatial Abilities and Mathematics from the Lab to the Classroom. Now I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Farran for tonight's webinar.
For the invitation today. I'm thrilled to be here to be giving one of the Learners webinars, and I've watched very many Learners webinars myself. So I'm going to be talking, as Richard said, about spatial abilities and mathematics. And I gave this title, The Talker from the Lab to the Classroom, because most of my research was very lab-based. And I'm going to be talking today about how we've been moving our understanding of spatial training and spatial interventions from lab-based training to classroom-based training. I'm also going to talk about how we've been translating the research evidence so that it's very useful for practitioners in their settings and classrooms. So I can't give a lecture about spatial abilities without explaining what I mean by spatial abilities. So here I've put a few sort of bullet points as to different kinds of spatial abilities. So it's not just one thing, it's a number of things. So it's about understanding the location of objects, other shape properties like their size, the shape of objects, and also the relationships between objects. A really key spatial skill is being able to mentally manipulate things in your head. So being able to visualize, so having that kind of blackboard in your head. And there are other things that we do which help us in terms of tools. So we use spatial language, words like in, on, above, and more sophisticated words like parallel and ascending to help us to sort of put across spatial concepts in an understandable way. We also use graphs. So many of us are presented with dashboards and graphs a lot of the time. And these are spatial representations of data. And then we use maps as a representation of our world. And we're using spatial abilities every day. So I've put a picture here of a dishwasher stacking. And so you may class yourself as an expert dishwasher stacker. That involves a lot of spatial skills if you're wanting to tessellate things so that you can get as many things in as possible, but also that they get clean. I've put an example here of some shoes in a box to demonstrate visualization. So when you see one shoe in a box and you've got the other shoe and you're used to them being side by side, you might mentally think about how you can make that shoe fit so it tessellates well with that other shoe. So you might manipulate it in your head using your visualization skills. And then we've talked about maps already. So in terms of the theory behind spatial abilities, there's one taxonomy which is one of the most supported. And this makes two distinctions. So it's a 2x2 taxonomy of spatial abilities, and it makes the distinction between what we call intrinsic spatial abilities and extrinsic spatial abilities. So that refers to things about the object, including their parts and their wholes, and then things about relationships between objects, so the extrinsic properties. And that distinction has been very well supported in terms of behavioral data and neural data. And then the other distinction between static and dynamic, so static being things that are not moving and dynamic showing movement. There's less of a distinction now agreed upon. It's more that it's a continuum, but you can see the example here that a static extrinsic skill would involve map reading, whereas a dynamic extrinsic skill would involve navigating, so moving through that environment. And so this slide here I use a lot. So this is a study now from a number of years ago, from 2009. And it's a really good example to demonstrate the importance of spatial reasoning for STEM subjects. So what you can see here is data from over 400,000 children in the US. So their spatial ability was measured when they were 14 years old. And then they were tracked for 11 years, and the degree that they chose to go into was tracked as well. And so what you can see on the x-axis is their spatial abilities. And so a higher number means they've got higher spatial abilities. And on the y-axis, it's the percentage of those people, those different spatial abilities, who went on to choose to do a degree in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And what you can see there is a really strong relationship that the higher people's spatial abilities are, the more likely they are to go into STEM degrees. And so let's think about this in terms of the broader picture. What does this mean, this relationship between spatial abilities and STEM degrees? So we know that in the UK, there's a STEM skills shortage. We also know that there's lots of future skills related to STEM that are going to come about as a part of the current technological and AI-enabled revolution that's happening. The Royal Society have also pointed out that as part of this employment revolution, there's an increase in use of data across careers. And Mass Horizons published a report just last month where they said that reasoning and problem solving are the key skills that are valued by employers. If we put all of this together, then spatial reasoning is really foundational to STEM. And one could argue that given that there's this global demand for STEM solutions, that if we're not thinking about children's spatial abilities and thinking about how important these are to train and teach, maybe are we risking decelerating some of the advances that could be made in terms of STEM solutions? And this links as well. In England, we have a number of Labour government missions at the moment, and two of these missions are quite relevant here. So in terms of breaking down barriers to opportunity, I'll talk about that later on, in terms of inclusion and spatial abilities, but also just from the information we've just talked about, there's economic growth that can come about by thinking more about children's spatial abilities. So if we think about the goal to increase the number of people going into and remaining in STEM careers, thinking about that STEM skills shortage, spatial reasoning is quite foundational to that. And to come back to the research, in the last few years, there's been a number of meta-analyses. So this is really, really useful for me. So meta-analysis is when you gather together journal articles and the research studies that have asked very similar questions. And because you're gathering them together, you can pool all of the effects that they're looking at to see how robust those effects are as a whole. So there's been a number of different meta-analyses. And here I'm focusing now on spatial abilities and mathematics. So in 2013, a lot of this research was sort of kick-started by a meta-analysis by Utah et al., where they demonstrated that spatial abilities are very trainable. So children's spatial abilities, if you train them, then they're going to get better at those spatial skills. So they're highly malleable. And that training not only is effective, it's durable, so it lasts and it transfers. So what that means is when you train spatial abilities, you don't only get benefits for spatial skills, but for the knock-on effects for other STEM disciplines. And in terms of mathematics specifically, Atit et al. Ran a meta-analysis on all of the studies at the time internationally where they'd looked at associations between spatial abilities and mathematics. And there were 45 studies at the time. And what they found was that across all age ranges, and males and females, that there's a really strong relationship So when children who are better at spatial abilities, are also better at mathematics skills, and equally children who are worse at spatial abilities have lower mathematics skills. And the perhaps most important meta-analyses for what we're talking about today, the Hawes et al. Meta-analysis also came out in 2022, and they looked at all of the studies again internationally that had looked at spatial training and its impact on mathematics. And at that point, there were 29 studies. And what they found is that when you train children's spatial skills, not only do their spatial skills get better, but so do their mathematics abilities. So there's a causal relationship between spatial abilities and mathematics. And what they found, which is relevant to some of the studies that I'm going to talk about later, is that this is most effective when the spatial training includes physical manipulatives, so concrete materials. In fact, for the primary school age range, they demonstrated that the impact of training, which is usually about 6 weeks, was the equivalent for mathematics of about 6 months of growth in mathematics. And just to hammer it home, Kelly Mix, who is one of the sort of key researchers in this area, just said that this is one of the most robust and well-established findings in cognitive psychology. Oh, I think I've gone too far. Yeah, sorry. And so I had a wonderful time in my lab in the sort of 2012, 2013, 2014, where I had a number of very, very good PhD students in my lab. So Alex Hodgkiss, Katie Gilligan-Lee, Sue Morris, Catherine Bates. And we set about trying to really understand these associations. So the associations between spatial ability and maths, spatial ability and science. And also we ran some sort of lab-based intervention studies. And these all fed into those meta-analyses and demonstrated this causal impact of if you train children's spatial abilities, then not only do their spatial abilities improve, their mathematics abilities too. So putting all of this together, hopefully I've convinced you that children with strong spatial abilities are more likely to be interested in science and mathematics, more likely to choose to go into STEM degrees and be good at STEM research, STEM careers. And so this quote here links to everything that I'm going to talk about in the rest of my slide, that maybe early attention to developing children's spatial thinking could increase their achievement in mathematics and science and nudge them towards STEM careers. And all of that evidence that I've shown you so far suggests that the answer to that is yes. And yet, I know we have an international audience today, and I do think the picture is relatively similar in many, many different countries. But to give a context in England, in terms of the mathematics curriculum, while spatial reasoning is mentioned, it isn't necessarily prioritised. So the early years foundation stage, which is children up to the end of reception, so 4 to 5-year-olds, they have early learning goals, and the early learning goal of shape, space and measure was removed in 2021. And whilst that doesn't mean that spatial reasoning isn't being taught, it's not being assessed. And so perhaps there's an argument that it might be deprioritized by practitioners. Ofsted in 2023, throughout primary school ages, said that geometry is often not prioritized. It's often left to the end of the summer term, for example. And when you look particularly at the Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 curriculum, geometry is underspecified. And that visualization skill, that mental blackboard that I talked about earlier, doesn't feature in the geometry curriculum. But policy documents are starting to state the central role of spatial reasoning for STEM. And so I've listed a few recent policy documents and some quotes from there, demonstrating that there's starting to be recognition of this very robust research, and that we need to really listen to the research and think about this in terms of an evidence base. So words like crucial, needing a stronger focus, and things being underutilized as a foundation are all listed here. I won't read them out to you, but this is starting to give traction, I think, in terms of the current situation in the English curriculum. And of course, as we know, we're currently going through a curriculum and assessment review in England. So I have my fingers crossed that this will feed through to that. So I'm going to talk about some of our research. So I said that I would walk you through the research where we started to think about making sure that we could take what we've learned so far into the classroom. So we wanted something that teachers could run and that was scalable in the classroom. And so we started with Lego. It's something that's very engaging. It's something that children and teachers are excited about. But before we wanted to run a training study or an intervention, we just wanted to check the associations between Lego and mathematics. So there are a number of studies that have shown that children with better Lego construction skills are better at mathematics. But we didn't really know why that was. And we thought that as much as there are other things involved, like executive function skills, motor skills, we wondered about spatial skills and whether there part of the relationship between Lego construction and mathematics performance could be explained by spatial skills. So our first study in the BLOCs project, which was funded by the Leverhulme Trust, was to look at associations between Lego construction and mathematics. We used physical Lego bricks, but because of the digital revolution, and we were very aware that a lot of children are playing Minecraft, Roblox, and things that require building, we had a digital and a physical Lego condition. So we had a digital game built for us where children could do exactly the same thing as in the physical condition, but digitally. So we ran a number of different spatial tasks. So we first measured children's Lego ability. So we put together some Lego construction tasks. Then we measured also their spatial skills. So there's a number of different spatial skills here. So you can, I'll just see if I can get the pointer to work. Laser pointer, here we go. So you can see we have a mental rotation task here. So in this task, the bottom animal is rotated slightly, and children are asked that if it was on its feet, which one of the animals at the top would it match? So they can be rotated as far as 180 degrees. We have a number line task. So this is spatial numerical representation. So this was a 0 to 100 number line task, and children were asked in this particular example, where is the number 46, and they have to put a line on it. This is a Corsi block task, so visual spatial working memory. So the experimenter taps out a sequence, and then the child has to copy it. The child can't see the numbers. An embedded figures task. So in this task, there's a hidden figure. So here there's a triangle hidden in this pram, and then a house figure hidden in this rocking horse. And there are a number of different trials. And I'll come back to these to see if you've got the answer later on. And then we had a scaling task. So you may not be able to see very well, but there's a little egg on each of these fields, and these fields are at different scales. And children were asked whether the egg was in the same position relative to the other items across those two different scales. And then for our mathematics task, we wanted to use standardized assessment. So we took the WIAT, which is a standardized test of mathematics. There's two parts of this. So there's a numeracy part, which measures arithmetic and calculation. And then there's a mathematical problem solving part, which has word problems and interpreting graphs and things like that. There is no geometry standardized assessment, but we were keen that geometry was included. And so we took material a little bit like the White Rose end of term assessments and created some a geometry measure from that. So just coming back to the embedded figures, if you haven't found the triangle, it's here. And then the house is, where is the house? Oh, it's just down here. So what we wanted to do through mediation analyses was to see how much of the relationship between Lego and mathematics was indirectly associated with spatial skills. And what we found is that across our different mathematics measures, that the relationship between that Lego accounted for up to 26.6% of variation in mathematics skills. So it's a really large percentage. And that indirectly, all of these spatial skills, with the exception of spatial scaling, was a significant mediator. So there were shared processes in Lego and mathematics of each of these spatial skills. And so that gave us the confidence to go ahead and to run our first sort of classroom-based intervention. So phase 2 of the BLOCs project, I just want to caveat this with the fact that the BLOCs intervention started at the beginning of January of 2020. And so this intervention, this is what was my very first classroom-based intervention. and the pandemic struck. And so it was a very, very long and difficult intervention to run. And I think that had some sort of impact on the results that we got, which you'll see later on. But in this intervention, we wanted to ask questions to do with digital and physical Lego training. So we wanted to know if children took part in some Lego training, would it impact their spatial abilities? Would it impact their mathematics skills? And are those effects similar or different? So we did extensive piloting because we had not done anything like this in the classroom before, and we were also sort of handing this over to teachers to run it. So we did a lot of piloting with the children and the teachers to make sure that it was motivational, that it was feasible for people to run. And the actual intervention itself, there were 206 children. They were years 3 and 4 of English primary school, so age 7 to 9 years. The school staff ran the intervention as a lunchtime club. Emily McDougall was the Lego lady. She was a fantastic postdoc on this project, and she made sure that the staff had a weekly visit from her. So she delivered the Lego and was able to catch up with the staff running the club. And they also had training on how to run the intervention and very extensive manuals as well. And because of work by Beth Casey's lab, we know that from a motivational point of view that a story theme is really important. So there was a story theme each week, whether it be aliens or scientists. So the children might say, oh, there's some plants under threat of extinction. You are scientists, you need to collect samples of the plants on day 1, and on day 2, you need to build the equipment that you're going to use to analyze the plants. So a kind of nice theme. And so what we did is at time 1, we asked children to take part in a number of tasks. So we had a kind of baseline of their spatial and mathematics skills. So similar tasks to in phase 1. And then they're in one of 3 conditions. So a physical condition, a physical Lego condition, digital Lego condition, and an active control or an active control condition. And then after the 6 weeks of training, we asked them to take part in exactly the same tasks again. The active control condition was something that we really struggled with. When we wrote the grant, we were going to do a meditation, active control condition. We piloted it, the children hated it. Then we did a mindfulness colouring active control condition. We piloted it, the children hated it. In terms of motivation, we had Lego here and our active control here, so we needed to even it up. So we had a craft active control condition. And in hindsight, if we'd have partnered with somebody who was in sort of vocabulary or language in the language domain, then it may have been a better active control condition. But within our team, in terms of expertise, we decided to do a craft condition, but we were keen that it didn't have sort of spatial instruction. So it was very, very free flow in terms of its instructions. So these are the details of the intervention itself. So the children watched a 2-minute video at the beginning where they're told what the theme is of the day. They're given their brick sets for the day. And then they have a booklet. So in the booklet, they have what we called an exploded diagram. So this is one of the plants that they were building. And you can see that this is what they need to end up with in terms of their model. And this is the instructions. So they're just pictorial instructions as to how to build it. Here's some of the physical models that children built. And then as children built the models, they could tick them off in their booklet. And this gave us a bit of a monitoring check as well. And the digital condition was the same, but rather than having the physical bricks, they built them in the digital game. And before the intervention started, they had a half-an-hour session to get them familiar with using the digital game. And then you can see this is an example of the active control. So it was very, very kind of limited instructions. So decorate a plant pot and make your own plant. And so in terms of results, as I said, we had a lot of difficulty running this intervention, but we were looking for near transfer. So that's improvement in Lego ability, medium transfer, which would be improvement in the spatial skills, and then far transfer, which would be improvement in the mathematics skills. And what you can see here that for the Lego, we didn't have any change in accuracy in terms of it being specific to the Lego group. So all 3 groups got better. But in terms of response time, we did find that both of the Lego groups showed more improvement in their response time. So they got faster between the pre and the post tests in their response time compared to the control group. So we have some evidence for near transfer in the Lego construction condition. But you can see here, no difference, no difference, no difference. So in terms of medium transfer for the spatial measures, unfortunately, we didn't find any change in the spatial measures in the two intervention groups relative to the control group. So there was some improvement in some of the groups, but it was never specific to the Lego conditions. In terms of far transfer for mathematics, in terms of geometry and overall mathematics, we didn't show any evidence of far transfer. For arithmetic, we showed some evidence of far transfer, but it was in the digital condition only. So we found that there was improvement from pre to post test in the arithmetic, in the digital condition relative to the physical Lego condition and relative to the control condition. So we had some evidence throughout the intervention of near transfer with Lego and far transfer for mathematics. Now, interestingly, when we went back and looked at the data and ran the mediation analysis as we'd had it in the phase, there we go, as we'd had it in the phase 1, we did show the same mediation. So we had a mediation effect in this study, which was similar, even though we didn't see those increases in the pre-post analysis. From Lego construction training, we showed evidence of both near and far transfer, but the far transfer was for the digital Lego condition only. And we pondered over that. We wondered if, because it's digital and children aren't able to sort of be hands-on with it, that it maybe meant that they had stronger mental representations, they were forced to have mental representations, or it may be as simple as the way in which the children were identifying the bricks in the digital condition meant that they were much more reliant on number by counting the pips on the bricks, for example. Whereas in the physical condition, maybe they could compare by size instead. And so that might be why. But there are other things that we needed to think about. So we went back to talk to the BLOCs teachers. We wanted to know what they thought of the intervention. And by this point, we had our next tranche of funding, and we knew that we wanted to do more work in the classroom. So it was really important, having done lots of piloting with teachers, that we also got lots of feedback from teachers at the end. So there was a real array of different feedback, some contrasting. So we learned that for some teachers, because it was lunchtime, and if the children didn't want to come to the lunchtime club, they just said, okay, well, I can't force you to be here, off you go. Whereas other teachers were saying, you really have to stay here because you've signed up for this. There were other teachers that said that the children really enjoyed it because it was Lego. But there was quite a lot of feedback that we could get in terms of it being a lunchtime club. People also felt very supported, and so that was really good feedback for us as well. So why do we think these training effects were limited? So one challenge that we're still on a learning journey, one challenge of taking things out of the lab into the classroom is sometimes you've got to compromise a little bit. And so one thing that we did in this first sort of foray and going into the classroom is we kept the training quite isolated. So by that, I mean that it wasn't sort of integrated into mathematics lessons, it was separate. We also didn't want to contaminate our sort of transfer effects. So we wanted any training that impacted spatial or mathematics to be implicit as a result of the Lego training, and not because the teachers were telling the children that this is important for spatial abilities or this is important for mathematics. So the teachers themselves didn't have any agency in this intervention. They didn't know what the kind of research rationale was while they were running it. They were blind to it. And whilst that gives us the scientific advantage of having a good understanding of any transfer effects, it does mean that the teachers maybe weren't as able to prompt the children or to kind of interact with the children in a way that may have helped them with their Lego and the knock-on effects of that. So there was no spatial instruction from the teachers, such as try turning the brick in your head, which would help them with their visualization skills. We also had a high attrition rate. The high attrition rate was partly because of COVID. So this was at a point where there were lots of, there was the bubble system. So if a bubble closed down, that whole part of an intervention would go. Or if a teacher had to isolate, then we were bringing in other people. We also found that because it was a lunchtime club, particularly in the summer term, that some teachers weren't particularly stringent in making children come along. We also found that because it's a lunchtime club, the children that were in the club were Lego enthusiasts. So perhaps these weren't necessarily the children that would really benefit from the training. And so maybe a more inclusive model might work better. And I've talked already about the control intervention and potential difficulty with that having spatial elements. And so we were then ready to run the space intervention, so spatial cognition to enhance mathematical learning. And this was a feasibility trial funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. And so based on the feedback from BLOCs, we kept a lot of the things as very similar. So we had the story theme, we had extensive piloting, we kept the length and the 12-session dosage. We had lots of monitoring checks, so checking the timings that teachers ran this for, the engagement ratings at the piloting phase. It was delivered at group level. We had the tick boxes still. We kept the weekly check-ins with teachers and the same sort of structure. And we had still these very comprehensive manuals and teacher scripts and videos. We changed some things though. So we decided that compromise of letting go of the scientific control so that we can look at transfer effects was not, we needed to compromise, and we needed to make sure the teachers, if we want this to be something that's scalable, that teachers are enthusiastic, that they needed to know about the background evidence, the evidence base to support the space program. So we created some professional development for teachers. This meant that they were aware of all the things that we've talked about today. This meant as well that they had strong confidence in what they were doing, an agency as well to deliver that intervention. We developed some prompt cards. So this meant that the teachers had spatial strategies at their fingertips via these prompt cards and through the professional development, so that while the children were doing the Lego sessions, they could prompt them. They could use spatial language to help them develop their use of spatial strategies. We made this a whole classroom intervention. So rather than a self-selected Lego club, we increased the diversity of the sample by making sure that the whole class took part. We also increased diversity by deliberately targeting a range of areas geographically for the different schools. It was also part of the maths lesson with that in mind. And we made it clear to the teachers how this links to mathematics. And we didn't just link it to obvious things like geometry. We showed how it links to mathematics in terms of arithmetic, in terms of measure, in terms of fractions, for example, so that teachers could see how spatial reasoning is important throughout mathematics in terms of a really broad focus. In terms of knowing that we were scaling up now, so we were going to be working with 15 schools all within the same time period, we reduced the amount of Lego. So now instead of a single Lego pack for each of the models, each child was given a space box. So their Lego box, which they could use for all of the 72 models throughout the sessions. And then the funder, because they were thinking about scale up as well, they wanted even the assessments to be run at a whole class level and by the teachers. They also reduced the amount of time that we had for the pre and post assessments. And the age group was slightly younger, so 6 to 7-year-olds. And so we had a similar research question. So does Lego training positively impact spatial and mathematical skills? So we had 15 schools take part. So there were 409 children in the space condition. We also had a number of these schools had a second class that they were happy to be in a business as usual control group. Again, it was 6 weeks, so 12 sessions delivered by their classroom teacher, this time in the maths lesson. And then in terms of teacher support, as we've shown already, we had the professional development and then a number of different resources. So you can see some videos that we had made up here Some of them are procedural videos as to how to run the assessments. Others are related to specific spatial skills, so spatial visualization, using spatial language, for example. And then we had the prompt cards as well, and you can see here different prompts for visualization, composition and decomposition, and representation. And on one side of the prompt cards, there was something to do with the Lego sessions, and then on the opposite side, there were prompts that could be used in the mathematics lesson. So in each session, the children had 6 models to build. We emphasized that accuracy was more important than speed, so they didn't have to get through all of the models. And the teachers were able to walk around the room and prompt children to use different spatial languages, different spatial strategies, and to model spatial language. And you can see here an example of some X-ray goggles that they were being asked to build from their space Lego kit. So in terms of our findings from space, we were able to measure 3 things in space. So we were only allowed to have up to 45 minutes of assessment time because it was being run by the class teacher in the classroom at a whole class level. So we measured spatial language. So here you can see that children were asked to circle the picture which goes with the phrase, "the road goes through the trees." And so there are a number of different prompts here or trials here with different spatial language. So through was the spatial language here. What you can see on the graph here is the blue is the control condition. So these children just had the pre and post assessments, but didn't take part in any training. And then the, what color is that? Mustard color is the space condition. And what you can see here is that there's no difference there between the control and the intervention condition. When you look at mental rotation, so this is similar to the mental rotation task that we had in blocks, but it was run at a whole class level. And here you see a really, really significant change. So whilst the intervention condition showed a strong change between pre and post intervention, the control condition didn't. And so this interaction here was significant. And then for mathematics, we also have an interaction. The mathematics task was quite a sort of short and fairly crude task. So we were only able to have 12 items in the mathematics task. But yet, even with that, we were able to show this significant interaction. So there was improvement in both of the groups, as you might expect, because they're all having mathematics lessons throughout that 6-week period. But the improvement for the intervention condition was significantly stronger than for the control condition. So we can demonstrate there that by taking part in space, children's mathematics abilities improved, which we were very, very pleased to find out. We also had some findings that we weren't necessarily looking for. So the space program was a feasibility trial, which meant there was an independent evaluator who was working with the teachers to understand how feasible and acceptable space was for them to run. And some of these teacher interviews brought through some really interesting results in terms of inclusion. So I put some quotes through here from the independent evaluation report. So children that had otherwise been identified as having lower abilities found that they could quickly grasp it. Children with English as an additional language really enjoyed the fact that this had visual instruction, so they could really sort of reveal this aptitude that they'd not otherwise been able to express. And this links to the English government mission to break down barriers to opportunity. And so it does make us think that spatial training could perhaps be something that is used to close attainment gaps. And in fact, there's a number of studies from America which have shown that children from what we might call left behind groups, so children from disadvantaged backgrounds, as an example, benefit more from spatial training and a spatialized curriculum than their peers, therefore sort of closing attainment gaps. So to conclude from space, I would like to argue that the classroom opportunities to engage in spatial reasoning and spatial thinking are a really effective activity for mathematics improvement. We've shown that in space. And that we can think about spatializing the maths curriculum. So we don't need to necessarily add more into the already packed curriculum, but we can emphasize how to use spatial strategies in the existing curriculum. And this has broad benefits for mathematics. So it's not just about geometry, it's about many different areas of mathematics. But we also need professional development. We need teachers to have agency. We need them to be supported if we want them to spatialize their mathematics teaching, and they need professional development guidance and resources. And so I'm going to move on to now, just for the next sort of 5 minutes, to talk about some of the resources we've been creating. So we've developed the Spatial Reasoning Toolkit. This is a collaboration with the Early Childhood Maths Group, and you can see all the wonderful people that were involved along the bottom of the slide there. And we were able to secure some money through the University of Surrey's ESRC Impact Accelerator account and from the Centre for Educational Neuroscience to develop the Spatial Reasoning Toolkit in a way that was kind of iterative. So we were getting feedback from practitioners as we went along. I won't go into all of the details, but our kind of baseline was to get a good understanding of where we were starting from. So we asked practitioners, this is results from about 100 different practitioners. If you were asked to explain what spatial reasoning is to someone else, how confident would you be in your definition? And you can see here that the majority were either not at all confident or a little bit confident. So we knew that this is where we were starting from in creating our documents. So this is the Spatial Reasoning Toolkit as it stands today. So we have a research summary and developmental trajectory, which I'll go through in a moment, but we summarized in accessible terms the research that I've talked about today, and then showed this in terms of developmental knowledge progression. We have a number of different posters. So posters are for different age groups with activities that you might be doing anyway, but how to make them more spatial, and then the spatial language words that you might model while the children are doing those activities. The videos, again, are across different age bands. So for under 3s, 3 to 4 and 4 to 7-year-olds. And then we have a video for children in the classroom and spatial reasoning at home. We have a whole list of different books that are related to shape, space and measure. And we have descriptions of these and what aspects of the curriculum they might link to. And then we have our spatial reasoning key rings. So these were a result of some of the feedback that we got through our focus group. So practitioners said, we really like the developmental trajectory, but I just can't have it with me all the time, and I really want to be able to refer to it. So we kind of distilled it down to a number of different key rings. So in the key rings, we've got 3 different key rings. So they're for movement and navigation, shape composition and construction, and shape properties. And on one side, it says what the child is developing to at that point in time. So whether they're 3 years or 4 years or even 6 months old. And then on the other side, how the adult can support that development. And you can buy the Spatial Reasoning Toolkit. So all of the Spatial Reasoning Toolkit is freely available on the Early Childhood Maths Group web pages as PDFs that you can download. So you can get it for free. But if you do want to buy hard copies, you can buy them from Early Education. So to show you the spatial reasoning trajectory, you can see here that this is part of the trajectory for 3-year-olds and 4 and 5-year-olds. And you can see we've laid it out in a way that's very similar to Birth to 5 Matters, which is a document that many practitioners use, showing what children are learning to do, what the adult might do, and what the environment might include. So, for example, if 4 and 5-year-olds are starting to understand relative position, the environment might include lots of equipment outdoors so that they can create an obstacle course, and then the adult might encourage the child to create that obstacle course and to narrate their way through that obstacle course, thinking about being in front or behind and going through and under and over, etc. And we evaluated the Spatial Reasoning Toolkit. I'll be relatively quick. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, but you can see the yellow and the light blue are the key things here, that for all of the aspects of the toolkit, people found it either very useful or extremely useful to a large percent. In terms of how people use it, they use it with planning, and they use it for their own professional development mainly. And it's been used a lot. So it's been adopted by Teach First, which is a major teacher training organisation. The National Centre for Excellence in Teaching Mathematics has used it in their spatial reasoning training pathway for primary school and early years. We used it in the Space Research Project. We've also referred to it in our Royal Society expert panel perspective on spatial reasoning. And I've been talking to Bright Horizons Nursery, who will be referring to this and using it in their Bright Beginnings curriculum. And this is the Spatial Reasoning Toolkit in action. So you can see here it was used in a Year 2 classroom in Surrey. And you can see children doing some obstacle courses, pulling apart some cereal boxes to look at the nets that they make, doing some navigation and treasure hunting. And this was a kind of Simon Says game where the teacher was using a lot of spatial language to see how the children could interpret that in their drawings. And some were more successful than others, as you can see. And because the spatial reasoning toolkit was with the early childhood maths group, which was specific to children from birth to 7 years, there was a lot of feedback that people wanted that spatial reasoning trajectory to go right to the end of primary school. So we've now worked with the Royal Society to create that spatial reasoning progression from birth right to the end of primary school, and to extend the trajectory document from 7 to 11 years. And I have one last slide. So just to kind of round up everything that I've talked about today, I think just going back to the beginning, thinking about the employment revolution that's happening, we need to really equip the next generation. They need to be future-proofed. They need to be able to have critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, all of these things that are brought about by this technological and AI-enabled change that we're going through at the moment. And teaching children to think and work spatially is a really good solution for this. It's evidence-based. We've shown it is an inclusive route as well. The other thing that's key is it's not expensive. It doesn't need extra activities. It doesn't need extra time in the curriculum. Existing content can be spatialized. I've put a QR code here for our spatial reasoning platform. This is the main place where I put any of our documentation. So we have a number of these 2-page policy briefings that you can share with people. We've got videos, we've got all of the resources that I've talked about today, and links to all of the projects that I've talked about today as well. And I think that's my last slide. Oh, and I do need to acknowledge everybody that has taken part in all of these projects, and all of the funders that have funded these projects as well. Thank you.
Emily, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. I've got a number of questions that people have been asking, starting with, how did you manage how did you measure Lego construction skills in order to evaluate the correlation between that and the math skills?
Yeah, that was a task that took a while to work out. So that was part of our piloting as well. So what we were able to do was take photos of every child's Lego model we had 6 different angles that we took a photo from, and then we coded it in 3 different ways. So we coded it in terms of how well each piece was put on the correct pips of the model, of the bricks below, whether each brick was in the right row, and also whether each brick was oriented correctly. And then we could put all those things together to make a composite.
Right, brilliant. Yeah, I spend a lot of time with my grandson doing the same thing. Do different spatial abilities differentially affect different mathematical abilities?
Yes. So I've been writing about this for the last 2 days, because I think that the next grant that I want to put in is to really understand this at a mathematical level. So we do know, we've very much differentiated this at a spatial level. So you will have seen that I had lots of different spatial tasks in there. But we haven't really, there are a number of studies that have pulled maths apart a little bit, but I think there's room to pull maths apart a little bit more, so that we have a much better understanding of which spatial skills best map on to which mathematical skills. But for example, we found that the children's embedded figures task, so that was the one with the triangle in the pram, that's involves disembedding, and that can be linked to understanding of place values. So children understanding units, tens and hundreds, which kind of makes sense because they're having to disembed the different numbers from that larger number. But yeah, I think there's a little bit more work that can be done in that area.
Okay, thank you. Have you found any dissociation between spatial performance with blocks and mathematical skills in children with dyspraxia or any special needs?
You know, it's almost like I've planted these questions. That's another thing that we're really thinking about at the moment. So a lot of the time, the research to date has very much sort of either excluded children that are on the SEND register, so have special educational needs and disability, Or as we've done in our research, we've said, well, this represents a typical classroom, so we're not going to exclude anybody. But nobody has really differentiated those different groups. And one thing that I'm really interested in doing is understanding whether there are certain profiles of spatial and mathematics abilities, and whether those profiles perhaps are linked to particular groups of children, and to better understand how interventions could be targeted, for example, at particular groups of children. But yeah, in terms of dyspraxia or dyscalculia or ADHD or autism, we don't have specific understanding for those groups.
Okay, thank you. Did WIAT test separate the sub-skill scores or produce one composite score?
So the two measures that we used were numeracy and I think it's called mathematical problem solving, but we didn't separate them any further than that.
Right. Okay. This sounds really valuable as a resource. Is there evidence around building these skills in children with specific difficulties in these areas? For example, neurological or neurodevelopmental conditions?
Again, I think this is something that we need more work on.
Yeah.
I would suggest that because we know that children from disadvantaged backgrounds, where there's more room for growth, they do benefit more from spatial interventions than their peers. There's a possibility that there might be other groups where we might see that sort of stronger benefit, but until we have some evidence for that, I'm not able to say.
Okay. I think we've covered this in the talk itself. Were the improvements fantastic? Says fantastic, first of all. Were the improvements in space for spatial skills and for maths greater in children who are often left behind, children with educational or SEND and lower income?
The only data we had, because this was a school-based intervention and the parents consented using an opt-out procedure, we weren't able to collect that kind of fine-grained data.
Right.
We did have data at the school level in terms of the percentage in that school of free school meals. And so we can differentiate at a school level, and it doesn't seem to show any difference. But I wouldn't want to say that that doesn't mean there isn't a difference, because obviously anyone within a school could be at any level.
Yeah.
And so we'd be generalizing if we were to use that variable.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting presentation on your research. Thank you. Just a general comment. This has made me think of the importance of spatial and math vocabulary used in interventions. Yeah, I was thinking the importance of language and the ability of kids to be able to verbalize what's actually happening when they're using this stuff. That's pretty critical in this, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually spatial language was something that we really did try to support through the intervention. We did measure spatial language, and we didn't show any kind of additional impact on the intervention group relative to the control group. But it may be that the frequency of spatial language use could have gone up. So we were just measuring whether they comprehended particular terms or not. And certainly the teachers seemed to have an impression that by modeling spatial language, the children were using more spatial language. But yeah, spatial language is a really strong support for mathematics, or any language is a good support for mathematics. So it is very important.
Yeah. Oh, that completes the questions I have at the moment. Thank you so much for answering those so fully. As Gaia says, thank you for your answer, Emily. So thank you so much again, Emily, for taking part this afternoon and for giving us this webinar, which will be on our website as soon as we can make it. Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody for participating this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.